Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here this morning to introduce Emily Grubert to you guys. I've been working with Emily for, I don't know, what, 3 years now or something like this? 3 or 4 years now. It's hard to count. A few semi-entertaining, to me at least, anecdotes about Emily. So one is, when Emily decided to come to Stanford, I got severe, I'll say blitzed, from multiple directions from people insisting that we convince Emily Grubert to come. Like multiple, unbidden by me, like people were sending me emails, Emily has applied, you need to get Emily to come. And so, she came highly sort of recommended and definitely has lived up to those sort of initial pestering from across the country. Emily's incredibly ambitious. A number of our faculty were here during her qualifying exam. At some point, I think I told her that what she proposed was going to take a decade. She's done most of it, which is amazing, in significantly less than a decade, in addition to teaching a bunch of classes and doing a bunch of other things. A third is that Emily has this amazing, you never know where she's going to be. You send her an email, she's touring a coal facility in southwestern Oklahoma or in Australia or somewhere else. And she's also not afraid to get her hands dirty. Her research, I do mostly computational stuff, her research weighs more in total than any other project I've been involved with. Weighs more than a car. She'll show you this product. But yeah, it's been great fun working with Emily. She's done some really great stuff here, and I don't know what else to say, but yes, Emily, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys all for coming. I know it's 9 a.m. on a Friday, and some of you are skipping a retreat to be here, so I appreciate that very, very much. And yeah, I will talk a little bit about my survey and the fact that it did weigh about 2,000 pounds or so more than my car, but maybe not all of your cars. So my project is called Improving Life Cycle Assessment as a Decision Support Tool using empirical data for multi-criteria prioritization. And what that really boils down to, and the question that I posed to the literally thousands of people I pestered about this over the last several years was, what is important to you? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we think are important and how we use those to make decisions. So to get started, usually if I were teaching, I would ask somebody to give me an energy in the news, but that's not what's going to go on today. So I'd like to ask you all to take a couple of seconds and just think about the place that you're from. Think about what you love about that place, and think about what you would be concerned about if something were to happen to it. That's essentially the starting question that I posed to thousands and thousands of people over the last couple of years. So now you are in the mindset of taking a survey, and I'll try to take you along that journey of why I did that for the next half hour or so. So just as a quick motivation, I study multi-criteria prioritization, and one of the things that is most important about this issue is that essentially all multi-criteria decisions require trade-offs. So I think a really classic example, and one that a lot of us face every day, is if you're having a cup of coffee or something like that, should you use a disposable cup or a reusable cup? And the answer is not necessarily super clear, depending on what you actually care about. If you care about urban landfill space, you might actually prefer the reusable cup because you're not putting things into that urban landfill. If you care about embodied energy, and you, like me, are not that great at not losing cups over time, although I still have that one, doing pretty good there, you might actually be better off using disposable cups. If you care about water, you might make different decisions depending on whether you actually ever wash your coffee cup and things like that. So it's actually not an easy decision, even in something that seems so simple. It's a decision that people make multiple times a day a lot of the time. Doing the sustainable thing actually depends on what it is that you're caring about and what it is that you're trying to make sustainable. You can't usually optimize for everything at once. So simple example, but this is essentially the core of what I asked over the last several years. One of the other ideas that I wanted to introduce before I get going a little bit further is that there's this very persistent idea that decisions can be objective and value-free. This is often referred to as the deficit model. It's actually been in the news quite a bit lately because of the March for Science going on tomorrow in particular, but there have been multiple news articles about this week. But the idea is essentially that if everybody has the same fact base, you will make the same decision. There's no value judgment in there. The deficit model, what that actually means is just that basically implying that the reason that people have different decision outcomes is because they have a deficit of knowledge. Therefore, if you are trying to communicate something, you just give people more facts, they will come to your ultimate decisions. With a colleague at the University of Texas, I did a bunch of interview research with people that work in water management related to the fossil fuel industry in particular, and we saw a lot of evidence that this model is how people are still thinking. So more data means that you'll get to the same decision. So we heard somebody say, when we asked them how they think about structuring their communications, this is how we know we're 100% neutral. We just let the data speak for itself. Somebody else saying, if they understood issues better, people might come to different conclusions. Very similar idea there. And then the last one, we do the science, we let the science speak for itself, and we will stand up in a room and say, the science says that this is right and this is wrong. Somebody else that we talked to who actually is an academic who works with a lot of community decision processes and has a lot of experience with this was kind of talking about the reason that this is often not that well received by communities, basically saying that this environmental science perspective is essentially saying, this is what the science says, so it's right, why are we arguing? And it's essentially saying, you're stupid, let's just understand the facts and then we can move forward from there. So just kind of a hint that people do react to deficit model communication somewhat poorly sometimes. What decision science tells us is that there's actually a lot more to making a decision. It's not just understanding the possible alternatives or prospects. It's actually about a lot more than that. So you need to think about uncertainty. Just, are your data any good? You need to think about risk attitudes. Would you rather have $50 now at a 100% chance, or would you rather have $100 with a 50% chance? People will make that decision differently. And then you need to think about preferences. So this is the classic apples and oranges question. Do you want an apple or do you want an orange? Maybe they both cost $1, but you probably have a preference about that. All of those things combine to make a decision. And one thing that I do want to mention here is that this doesn't mean that you're suddenly kind of putting everything to the wind and not having a way to make a decision that is fact-supported. Decision science is normative. There are still right and wrong decisions. The big difference between this and kind of the previous deficit model view is essentially that in this case, you make your value judgments explicit. There are value judgments. They can vary by person. They can vary by community, but they're explicit, and that kind of helps you see the contours of the decision you're trying to make. So to pivot a little bit into one of the methods that I really take a pretty close look at, when we think about multi-criteria decisions, one of the major engineering tools that's out there to look particularly at sustainability-based decisions is called life cycle assessment, or LCA. There are a couple of different aspects to LCA. It's a broad and a deep method, and it's essentially a way of describing these alternative futures, the prospects. You get as much data as you possibly can. One thing that you do when you do an LCA is that you look at the entire life cycle. So from material extraction all the way through to the point where it's disposed, recycled, whatever. So if I wanted to look at this podium, I might start with the forestry product, maybe the petroleum product. I'm not quite sure with this one. Looks like bamboo. It's a lead building, it's bamboo. But I start there and then get all the way down to, through the point where it's been sold at the Stanford surplus store a few times, and finally it's so broken that you need to dispose it somehow, whether that's composting it or landfilling it, whatever. But I think about all those different stages. That's the breadth part of LCA. The other element of actually describing what's going on with this prospect, so in this case my podium, is actually looking at as holistic a set of outcomes as you can come up with. These are expert defined, but essentially the idea is you look at a bunch of different categories of impact. So I'll look at the climate impact, I will look at smog impacts, I'll look at water pollution impacts, and there are a bunch of other ones. A lot of people argue about what exactly these should be, but they are numerous and quite well defined for environmental LCA at this point, at least. So I do that for all of the different life cycle stages. So this is intended to be a very comprehensive, very holistic way of describing what your prospect is. I'll note quickly something that I'm not going to talk about too much today that is a pretty big part of my work is that one of the next frontiers in LCA, and the one that I actually find the most interesting, is the idea that you do this not just for environmental issues, but also for social and financial issues. So you kind of look at triple bottom line sustainability at the same time. That's a little bit harder because this list gets much longer when you do that, but just to kind of comment there quickly. So how does this relate back to the deficit model? LCA is at its core essentially a deficit model tool. The more data you have, the more you can show up to a decision maker and say, look, I understand what these prospects look like. You can make your decision because I've given you as much data as I possibly can. The problem with this is that actually some of those other decision parameters that I talked about earlier, so the uncertainty, the risk, and the preferences are actually quite a lot more sensitive. So to take a little bit of a toy example quickly, something that I did with Adam a couple of years ago, Methane leakage is probably underestimated in LCA inventories. So this is a pretty well-known problem. We looked at it. The data project that we did basically suggested that methane is probably underestimated by a factor of 2 or 3 in some cases in some of these databases. So just looking at a fertilizer example, just as a kind of illustration of this, what we found was that depending on what database you're looking at, you maybe say that methane is 8% of the CO2 emissions, maybe it's 20% of the CO2 emissions. That seems pretty big. So you're an LCA practitioner, a factor of 2 or 3 is actually pretty large, and you probably do want to spend some time trying to get that number down. And that's a very worthwhile thing that a lot of people spend time on. That said, a couple of years ago, somebody did work looking at risk attitudes, so essentially how you think about discount rates is the way that they implemented it, and found that just changing your risk attitude can change your results by a factor of 1,000,000. So from 2 or 3 to 1,000,000 when you start looking at this. Stuff that I look at, not to be a little one-uppy about the risk attitudes, but preferences really can affect your results by however much you possibly want. There's not really an upper bound on this because essentially if you say you don't care about smog, smog's gone. You just don't look at it anymore, even if you have all the data. So what I'm arguing here is that right now, LCA is kind of a deficit model decision support tool. Adding in these issues about things like risk attitudes, about uncertainty, and about preferences can make it a much more valuable tool for people that are actually trying to use this to make a real decision. So effectively, at the end of the day, I argued that LCA actually needs to provide decision makers with better support by including some of these intercategory trade-off issues. The other stuff, the risk attitudes, the uncertainty, and all of that are also extremely important, but there are other people working on that also, which is great news. One of the issues when you start looking at preferences is that preferences do vary. So what I propose is a tool for values-based sensitivity analysis. Not just, this is the value, this is the average value that everybody has, apply that as a weighting factor and move on. Take a bunch of different value systems and kind of apply that as a sensitivity analysis tool to check for robustness for your decision. So if under 5 different views of preferences you come out making the same decision, that's probably pretty robust. The other thing that I argue is that because impacts aren't universal, it's actually somewhat relevant to consider who is providing the values. And so I'll talk a little bit today about the work that I've done over the last couple of years, looking very specifically at geographically defined populations to derive some of these value systems. So with that, let me just kind of touch on my approach and research questions, and then we can talk about the 2,000-pound survey for a bit. So given that LCA is increasingly used either by choice or by requirement to support policy decisions, and one of the examples that comes up a lot here is California's low carbon fuel standard, that a law in the state of California that actually tried to use LCA as part of the policymaking process and ended up in court over it. How do you actually design decision science into LCA to make it a better tool that's more suited for those types of processes? Given that LCA currently has limited scope to support these trade-off analyses, and this is just a little picture of an output from one of the most popular LCA software tools, that's essentially the image that you hand a decision maker and tell them to make the trade-offs based on. These little teeny things that you can't read even when they do come out of the software directly are basically all the different impact categories, so carcinogens, things like that. But this is essentially what you hand a decision maker now, often with a 100-page report behind it. So this is an engineering tool. We apply science to make problems better. So how can we use rigorous social science techniques to actually think about supporting some of those trade-off decisions in addition to the rigorous natural and physical sciences that we already use? And then the last issue, LCA is a data-heavy method. It's fundamentally quantitative. Something like this needs to preserve the ability for the method to remain quantitative, and that actually carries quite a lot of expensive and time-consuming data collection burden. So given that, this just flashing up there for a second, to buy some of the databases that exist now, even with the flaws that they have, is thousands and thousands of dollars a license a year. Just to give you a sense of the scale, if you're doing a real LCA for a company or something like that, those can run you a couple $100,000 if you're doing one really in a lot of details. This is an expensive thing to do. Given that, and given that I'm proposing to add an additional huge layer of data and information that you need to this method that's already data heavy, how can you actually use non-traditional tools? So in this case, particularly things like data mining, text mining, to reduce the costs of data collection, increase your ability to react to changes in the method, and ultimately actually maybe even think about getting your data to be a higher resolution. So those are kind of the 3 things that I think about and what I will talk about for the next little bit. So survey's making its appearance. We're rolling into that, you know it's coming. Let me talk about some of the methods that I used. Kind of top level, what I did was look at case studies to actually study how attitudes about trade-offs occur in energy-producing communities. One of the reasons that I look at energy-producing communities in particular is because a lot of the time these are the communities that are at the center of some fairly serious multi-criteria decisions that are sort of ongoing policy questions in the United States right now. These are the economic issues, you know, the war on coal, as it were, but also the war on climate, all of these types of things. Some of these really, really big policy decisions actually do affect these towns pretty carefully. The other reason that I wanted to look at energy-producing communities in particular is because with a lot of the different things that we see analyzed by LCA, many people may not have actually experienced those firsthand. If you live very close to an oil field, you're a little bit more likely to understand how some of these things might impact you in your day-to-day life. And so the idea was essentially that these populations would be a little bit more familiar with some of the constructs that I was testing. Also, they're interesting and really kind of fun to work with. So let me talk a little bit about several of my case studies. There are a couple more I'm not going to talk about today. First set is these two solar thermal facilities, one in Southern California and one in Nevada. Essentially, the idea here was to look at the influence of proximity to a project on attitudes. So this one down in Ivanpah, some of you may have driven by it, is basically on the I-15 between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. It's a very visible project. Not a whole lot of people live there, but very, very extreme exposure, just in terms of the number of people that drive by. There are sort of PSAs about making sure that you bring your sunglasses with you because they can be kind of bright. Like, this is a very visible project. Crescent Dunes I actually didn't know about until my husband and I were driving by it after a trip to Death Valley, and he's kind of like, is that a giant solar power plant right there? It's so remote that when I went to a meeting to talk to some of the town board people about some of our findings last summer, I referred to the community as rural, and they stopped me and were like, honey, we're frontier. It's very isolated. It's about 110 miles from the nearest gas station other than the one in that town. They do have Tesla superchargers, so if that's more your style, you're good. But the point here is that these projects have very, very different visibility, and I suspect that might affect people's attitudes toward different environmental outcomes. Another one is looking at a couple of the biggest shale oil fields in the country right now. So the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas and then the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. The idea here was essentially to look at these two areas that have experienced rapid oil development over the last 10 years or so in extremely different geographies. So for those of you who have been to either of these places, here you're worried about maybe 120-degree temperatures in the summer. Here you're worried about minus 40 in the winter. This looks very, very different when you start thinking about how an impact might actually manifest. Even if you have the same impulse, the effect might be quite different. Third one is essentially looking at the influence of the purpose of the project on people's attitudes about it. So taking a look at the Bowen Basin in Queensland, Australia, and the Powder River Basin in Wyoming here in the United States. These are both large coal-producing facilities, both big surface mining areas. The Bowen Basin mines are essentially there pretty much purely for export. The Powder River Basin mines are there almost purely for domestic use. When you interview people in these places, that difference actually does come through in the way that they talk about it. So folks in the PRB will often refer to the fact that they're proud that they're providing energy for the country, things like that. In Queensland, it's much more of a, we're providing coal that can be exported and sent somewhere, and there's really a lot less of that kind of patriotic aspect to it. So I wanted to look at the influence of the purpose of the projects on people's attitudes about them. Then the last pair, which is a little bit less obvious that this is a pair, but turns out to actually fit quite well that way, is essentially looking at the influence of being very close to externalities on people's attitudes. So these I have called sites of contention. Essentially one being the induced seismicity situation that's going on in Oklahoma, where you've got a lot of wastewater injection being put back in the ground after oil development, creates some earthquakes. Wanted to think about that influence of that very rapid kind of out of nowhere influence that people hadn't been living with previously and now are. Then the other one that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a few minutes is this proposed site for gas extraction in southern Australia. In that situation, basically this project created a lot of social tension. The project never actually happened, but the externality there was much more social than environmental. So that's the last pair that I'm going to reference today. I also wanted to kind of briefly stop and say that one of the reasons why energy is also interesting from a multi-criteria perspective is just that you do engage so many of these different things. So in those case studies, you find these very, very salient issues where you're looking at things like wages, you're looking at housing. In Williston, North Dakota, maybe you can make 20 bucks an hour working at Walmart, but you're also paying San Francisco prices to live here. In Australia, you see a lot of influences of things like the unions. This is actually also temporary housing, so slightly different approach than was taken in North Dakota, but you think a lot about how to house workers, how to pay workers, that sort of thing. At the same time, in some of these areas, you also think a lot about the environmental things that are going on. So this one is South Texas. People are a little bit worried about an oil field waste site that's being proposed in that area. The two solar thermal facilities are also kind of interesting because they both look like they're in the wilderness, but one's actually a military brownfield site, and one is a site that houses a lot of endangered tortoises. So just when you start thinking about the kinds of things that come into play when you think about siting a project, there's a lot going on here. So to get at actually the methods, I use 3 major data sources to kind of inform these, what I call archetypes about different value systems that you find empirically when you start talking to people about the kinds of preferences that they have. The first one, and the one that's sort of the source for most of the quantitative data that I present, is a survey. So it's a mixed quantitative and qualitative instrument that I developed, and the idea here is to be descriptive. You ask people what they think, they tell you, you're not really trying to get at why, you're just sort of trying to describe what they say. There's some issues with people self-reporting and things like that, but more time for that in questions in a bit. The idea with surveys was essentially to look at individual people's preferences and try to detect whether there are patterns of priority that emerge from this. So if you ask 1,000 people what they think, are there 4 or 5 different systems of thinking about some of these issues that emerge? The second big data source that I used was interviews, actually. So in this case, these are almost entirely qualitative. The idea here is to explain where some of the answers to the survey are coming from. So when you talk to people and you start asking them things like, well, what is it like to live here? You get a little bit more of an idea of what the cause of some of those survey responses might be. This is a really useful thing to do, not only because it helps you pilot and stuff like that, but also because it actually helps you understand whether the patterns that you see make sense. So if you talk to a bunch of people and they all start saying that there's no hospital in their town, when you see a massive spike for healthcare as a priority in that place, that sort of helps you understand what's going on. The idea here is, again, kind of to say, why do people express the priorities they do, and do these archetypes make sense? Then the last big data source that I've been using is text mining, and here the idea is essentially to take a quantitative view of qualitative data to describe what's going on in a way that is based in documents that already exist in a lot of cases. And the idea here, I'll talk a little bit more about what this actually is, because I know this one might be a little bit less familiar for folks, but the idea here is essentially to ask, can machine learning techniques essentially expose some latent preferences that people express in the way that they write about things? And more importantly, can these actually start to approximate sort of what are considered the gold standard survey results? The reason that that's interesting, so the survey system that I did, I sent about 12,000 surveys out to US addresses, actually got one back in the mail today, returned because it was not deliverable to sender. So now I have enough for my whole committee to have a copy, which I didn't this morning. I aggressively resent them, so I don't have a whole lot of extras. But that's them in my living room. Very heavy, something you don't really necessarily think about when you start doing a survey. We also sent, I and a colleague from E-IPER who's since graduated, sent about 1,000 around Australia. A company handled those, so a little bit of a different situation, but this is a pretty medium-sized to large mail survey. In the United States, we saw about a 5.6% response rate. Sounds very low. By some standards, that is very low, but for something like this where there's not a whole lot of direct salience for people that are receiving the survey, because we very intentionally didn't want to ask people, like, what do you think about fracking? Figured that might change their answers. So low salience and general population survey, so I'm not sending it to someone who has a reason to care. This is actually pretty good. I've talked to people that have seen more like 2% response rates in similar studies. We've got about 93% cooperation, which is actually very, very high for a study like this. Probably an upper bound, but if you look at the way that survey statistics are calculated, what this essentially says is that if people read it and then complied with the instruction to send back a blank survey if they didn't want to participate, of the people that actually took that next step, 93% of them actually filled it out. Often what you see is more like 50 or 60%, so this is actually encouraging and is likely because the survey was fully anonymous. In terms of cost, and this is where the text mining stuff becomes a little bit more interesting too, this came back at about $36 a response. That's quite normal for a survey like this, but that does turn out to be pretty expensive. So you multiply that across all the different responses you get, This is an expensive study to do. So if you can approximate the results kind of close enough without having to do this, you're going to save yourself a lot of money and time probably as well. On the interview side, I conducted about 40 interviews in 5 regions. I had a couple of research assistants who did a few more, one of whom is here. And then on the text mining side, essentially what I looked at were several different sources of documents and kind of tried to figure out what different patterns I could pull out of those documents. So one being academic documents, actually. When people write journal articles about LCA, what are they looking at? Another one that I'll talk a little bit about is narrative documents. So when people write books about energy, what kinds of preferences do you see lying in those texts? I also examined the qualitative responses to my survey, just to kind of get a sense of when you actually have the same people providing written documents versus these sort of self-reported priorities, can you sort of match those up? The idea there was to create a little bit of a control for this last idea, which is kind of what I'll be working on for the next few months, which is looking at documents that were not written in the context of the survey from the same types of regions and trying to figure out whether you can see the same sorts of patterns. So this is kind of how I did this. To kind of introduce quickly the reason that text mining makes sense in this context, just because I do know that it's a little bit unfamiliar for a lot of people, you can see pretty clearly that written texts do express values. This is actually a really interesting example of this, looking at a couple of American novels about oil and Appalachian coal written about the same time. So this is a 2008 novel about oil. These both describe disasters. In the oil case, people start talking about men running for their lives. Cost the crew 10 days labor to shut it down. This is horrible. There's been a blowout. It's very, very terrible. But you transition pretty immediately in this passage to, it was sweet, high gravity oil, so pure, you could almost pour it directly into your gas tank. This is a very positive view of a very negative event, actually. Contrast that with coal. Similar thing, written in 2007, just a year earlier. This is about an Appalachian coal mining area, also fiction. These are both novels, describing a coal mine waste blowout. Essentially, this one starts with the disaster. The mountain is honeycombed with abandoned deep mines. It's not a super positive image. You kind of go through this. 306 million gallons of poison muck killed everything in the waterways for 100 miles. Same idea, big disaster. This one is terrible. This one's kind of fine. You see that in a lot of the ways that we actually talk about oil and coal in the United States, where people do actually tend to give oil a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt than they give coal, at least Appalachian coal. So just a little bit of an illustration, our novels do actually express things that you can detect in political discourse as well. And this is one of the reasons that this is an interesting thing to do. All right, so let's talk findings. This is Crescent Dunes, if you ever get a chance to hang out by a solar thermal facility, candles in the desert. So first thing, looked at about 8,200 academic articles written about LCA in the last 20 years, 95 to 2014, and based on a couple of other studies that have been done on bibliometrics and things like that. This is thought to be pretty close to comprehensive in terms of the peer-reviewed literature. Used a topic modeling technique, which essentially clusters different groups of words. You interpret them as the expert and are able to kind of assign them to different ideas of what this topic might look like. So having read probably about 300 of these articles directly and manually, and then looking at some of the results from this topic model, what I essentially named all these different topics were systems analysis, which is kind of a general view of things, health, and climate change. And what you see over the last 20 years of LCA development is that the climate change and the health topics have essentially traded off pretty much directly. The reason that this is important is because even though we talk about LCA as being a fully objective method with no value judgment, like I said earlier, when you apply a preference and you make something go away, it's gone. And what you do see a lot is in the recent literature, people will often focus on single issue LCAs. I should comment briefly, kind of in defense of this field and my field, you don't actually see this pattern in the LCA specific journal. You see it in other journals that are using LCA. So the LCA-specific journal actually stays pretty much looking at everything pretty evenly. Everybody else does pretty much climate-only work now. It's kind of an interesting finding. But this is the motivation for saying, yes, we do need explicit prioritization because we're not doing that well at not prioritizing. So what we say we're doing isn't happening. So what does that actually look like? From the survey data, and this is actually from a study that looks a little bit more directly at the US generally, not specific communities, you can actually detect indeed these archetypes of patterns of priorities that people express. So this is a slightly smaller study. I only looked at 14 issues. The full study looked at 30. But basically what you see this is about 500 people's worth of responses. It's an analytical hierarchy process model if anyone does that kind of work. People care a lot about safety. People care a lot about health. People care a lot about water. These dots are essentially, if you divide up into 100% of your priority that you're going to allocate, this is in order what people thought. You get into archetypes, and I've named these. These are names that I assigned, not names that came out of any model or anything like that. One of them you see, and the bars kind of show where this particular archetype derived using k-means clustering comes from. In this case, what you see is that safety is heavily, heavily prioritized in one archetype. This is an explainable thing. People do care about safety a lot, so that one makes sense. You see another one where there's a huge spike in people's preferences for water over other things. This one also actually makes sense based on a lot of the interviews that I did. Water is actually one of the more compelling environmental problems that people think about. Another one, you see a huge priority for air quality and health. So a lot of this livability thing, but largely related to being kind of outside, and there are a couple of other markers of that too. A fourth one really looks at what I've called livability. What you see here is this huge, huge overemphasis relative to the entire sample on wages, but also on things like the local character of the community and the diversity of the community and stuff like that. The ones that are overrepresented here tend to be kind of, is this a good place to live and can I stay here for a while? And then the last one, which is a little bit different from that wage-focused livability one, really focuses on community, where you see this large, large emphasis on things relative to the average, on things like community future, local character, stuff like that. So what I'm basically trying to argue here is that you actually can derive patterns of priority that make some sense. You can kind of think about talking to a person and understanding that these are priorities that a person might express. The other sort of interesting thing about this result, at least to my mind, is that what you see is that people generally do agree on what the important things versus the less important things are. So you get these patterns that differ, and differ significantly enough that it actually does make sense to try to use these for a sensitivity analysis. But for the most part, people agree safety is an issue. People agree that health is an issue. And those things are relatively consistently ordered. And you see this in the bigger study as well. I should also mention this is a k-means clustering study. A lot of people get a little bit concerned that one of the archetypes might actually just be one or two people. Actually, in this case, what you see is that they're relatively well divided. This is not a representative study, and this shouldn't be taken to say that 25% of people feel this way. But from the k-means, these are actually true patterns that do kind of persist across multiple people. To kind of turn to some of the results from the more local studies, what I found is that local context does actually matter quite a lot. So communities do have different concerns based on who they are and where they are. These three examples are sort of interesting because they're the least urban of the ones that I looked at for my case study. So Crescent Dunes, this very, very isolated frontier town. The Powder River Basin in Wyoming, where really the biggest town for several hundred miles is 30 to 50,000 people, depending on the year. People go to Denver, which is like 8-hour drive away for big city experiences. And then the Bakken, North Dakota, which is actually more isolated than the PRB. It's not too far away from there. But these less urban places tend to prioritize more community scale things than more national scale things. And what you see is that they tend to have issues like local character, community future, stuff like that, overemphasized relative to the sample as a whole. Underrepresented, and the things that you see a lot in the much more urban case studies are things like climate change, the ozone hole, acid rain. These issues that you maybe associate with cities, but also associate with the country as a whole. So less urban, you do tend to see that people think a little bit more about their local conditions. The other thing that's interesting about these results is that the resource matters as well. So these are all isolated communities. They're all energy-producing communities, and they've all seen a lot of changes to that condition recently. So these two with a lot of production growing, this one actually with a lot of production shrinking and causing some social upheaval that way. But what you see is that in the oil and the coal communities where you're dependent on a depletable resource, people tend to be a little bit more economy focused. One spike that I found really interesting is that you tend to see more emphasis on education in those places, probably as a little bit of this idea that you do need more worker training, stuff like that, which is something that I heard in some interviews. You also see issues like long-term job prospects explicitly emphasized more than the rest of the sample. You see mineral supply, which maybe doesn't surprise people that much overemphasized, and you see wages. In the solar communities, by contrast, you see a little bit more of an emphasis on preserving wilderness, which also sort of makes sense. These are places where a lot of the time people live because there's not a whole lot around there. So sort of an interesting finding, but resource matters, context matters, and actually looking at the specifics of the place where you're putting a project into place matters. So why do values matter generally? Like, we can say a lot about whether people prefer one thing versus another, but why does that actually matter? One of the case studies that I did with Whitney Skinner, who graduated from here a couple of years ago down in Australia, was looking at this community where people were thinking about putting in place a gas development. What we found that actually was pretty surprising is that fairly significant social harm can occur even if the project actually never happens. This project was canceled midway through our project after about 15 years of discussion. And the fact that people had not had a place to express the things that they cared about and express the things that they wanted to prioritize was a very consistent theme. We did a lot of interviews here. One person telling us, people all like this place. We all love Gloucester. We just disagree with the way that it's going to be used. And that came up again and again. Another comment where people are talking about the fact that just thinking about whether you want to support or oppose this gas project generates enormous tension in the community because you start kind of pitting yourself against these pretty deep other social things that are going on. So in this case, this town's about 2,800 people, pretty isolated, everyone knows each other, and we heard repeatedly stories about friends not talking to each other again, family members splitting up, people slashing each other's tires, boycotting each other, all this sort of thing. So massive, massive social harm that often was sort of explicitly attributed to the fact that the question was only ever yes gas or no gas. It was never yes gas as long as, or no gas but. So that came up a lot, just kind of to emphasize that values do matter. And you can actually have pretty significant problems associated with not addressing them directly. So the big kind of money question, does text mining actually work on this sort of thing? Still a little bit under development. This is probably a pretty long-term project because there's a lot going on just in methodological development and things like that as well. But just to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the work that we did, this looks at 60 books, basically, 15 coal fiction books, 15 oil fiction books, 15 coal nonfiction books, and 15 oil nonfiction books, all written by American authors in the last 15 years. We did some sentiment analysis on this. In this case, is me and my advisor, Mark. And what we saw were actually coherent emotional results from these texts. This is actually a really, really good sign. When you think about what kind of makes sense for the way that people might be talking about these resources, we actually do see that emerging from the method. So looking at coal, on the fiction side, you see disgust and sadness overrepresented. The blue bars represent emotions that are overrepresented by at least 10% relative to the overall corpus. The orange bars are underrepresented by about 10%. On the nonfiction side, similarly, you see anger, and then you see a dearth of joy and surprise. The way that we talk about coal in America, that actually does kind of make sense. The other really interesting one that does make sense, even though it looks like it doesn't, is the fact that trust is actually pretty low for the coal fiction texts, and trust is pretty high for the coal nonfiction texts. Why is that? That seems like a contradiction. The coal fiction texts, and I read about half of these, tend to focus on one family or one person, and they tend to be things like, I was born in this coal hauler, I have lived here, I went to work, I had this great dream that my family was going to be happy and that my job would provide me with opportunity, stuff like that, and then it didn't happen. Thanks, coal, basically. So low trust, that hope gets dashed. In the nonfiction texts, these tend to be much longer views of the industry. A lot of them tend to cover a couple hundred years, multiple dynasties, really. And what you tend to see is that the trust words are associated with things where you trust coal to behave the way that you expect it to. So coal destroyed another community. Well, we're used to that. That's a trustworthy thing for it to do. And so, and I should back up and say this is not necessarily how I feel about coal, but this is what you see in these texts. And it is something that's fairly consistent with the sort of public narrative about the resource. On the oil side, you also see pretty coherent results. So in the fiction, you see a lot of joy and surprise. Usually this is when somebody hits a gusher. They're usually pretty happy about that. And then in the nonfiction, you actually see very, very little joy. That's usually because these are economic histories. Not a lot of joy in those. But the results make sense. And this is actually important because sentiment analysis is a little tricky. Emotional analysis can be even trickier still. So this is a very encouraging start. One last thing that I kind of wanted to talk about quickly was that when I actually did some text mining on the qualitative results to the survey itself, there are also coherent results. So again, a very promising view of what's going on. On these charts, the Eagleford shale tended to be more on this side of the line. The Bakken shale results are on that side of the line. What you basically see is that doing these topic models, which topics are more represented in either cluster. So in this case, when you ask people what positive things they think about their local environment, people in the Eagleford tend to be more interested in their surroundings. People in the Bakken are more interested in wilderness. That actually does correlate relatively well with the quantitative data. Some other similar things. This one I really love. It's a negative thing about your local environment. People in the Eagleford, South Texas, consistently referred to living things that they didn't like. That is straight up fire ants, explicitly a lot of the time. People do not like fire ants in South Texas. This makes sense, actually, if you've ever been bitten by a fire ant. Similarly, you look at positive things, and you do start to see these trends that are reflected in the survey quantitative data, and you can actually draw out even though these are actually exceptionally small vocabularies. So this is a couple hundred people writing 3 or 4 words each. Not a lot of data to work with, but the fact that you can get these coherent differences that are relatively strong is actually really, really promising. Yeah, so a little bit more on some qualitative stuff. So with all of that, let me just talk a little bit about some of my conclusions and then get into some future work as well. So the first, and I think overriding conclusion of my work is that values matter. This is kind of the hypothesis that I went into with, and I have not been disillusioned of that assumption. Contentious discussions about science, and in this case, a lot of the time about energy project siting, whatever else it is that you're looking at, are often really at their core about values. If you introduce that into the conversation, a lot of the time you can get a little bit further. That's some work that I didn't talk about today, but that is pretty well understood. The other big takeaway is that essentially all multi-criteria decisions do require some trade-offs based on values. At the level where you're looking at an entire project or an entire infrastructural development, you're really not ever going to end up in a situation where one thing is explicitly and monotonically better than the other thing in all ways. Other big conclusions, life cycle assessment, I think, will be a stronger decision support tool when it actually addresses all the elements of a decision. This is not necessarily something that can't happen, which is good as well. So empirical preferences like the ones that I showed actually can be quantified and can be used in a way that allows for sensitivity analysis to values and allows for some robust decision support. The really important thing about this use of it as a sensitivity analysis is that you don't necessarily need to be 100% sure that you've captured exactly what the population thinks. As long as you have relatively good spread, you can really start to think about robustness. If you have conflict, you can start to think about where you maybe do want to invest in more data, stuff like that. One of the big issues with doing something like this really does depend on the LCA community agreeing on which categories you're using. So especially if you're going to invest in a lot of data generation, asking people about their preferences for different categories actually depends on you all agreeing what those categories are. For social life cycle assessment, this is a particularly difficult challenge. Environmental, we're probably pretty well off, but that's kind of something coming down the pike. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on that I think is actually pretty exciting is that if you do get traction on ideas like this, it's actually not that hard to implement. LCA is a software-based tool. If you really do get enough support, you can pretty much push this out to a lot of people that are doing LCA pretty quickly. It's not just convincing every single practitioner to do it all at once. And then the last conclusion is that text mining tools are actually a pretty promising way for getting at some of this values data without having to redo $50,000 studies every single time you want to do anything. So this is a good approach to ensuring that those archetypes are actually available for use, that they're adaptable. So when you do change your impact categories and your ways of thinking about those, you can pivot and come up with new preferences relatively quickly. And they're tools that can be run more than once. They can be run over time. You can do historical analysis, things like that. So that's good. But a lot of continued development and a lot of testing is obviously needed to do this, and that's a lot of what I'm going to be spending my time on in the future. With that, I'd love to make a couple of acknowledgements and then take some questions. This is the only slide I've had designed for more than a year. I would like to acknowledge my funders. is a real survey response, and I understand that. I just told you about how resource allocation is a difficult question. This person doesn't necessarily think tax dollars are good for this type of work. I personally was supported by the NSF and very much appreciate that. The survey was largely funded by everything else, so no tax dollars were actually spent explicitly on the survey. But I do want to acknowledge a lot of these sponsors that enabled me not only to have research assistants, but also to actually go to a lot of these places, do a lot of these interviews, and actually complete a massive $40,000 mail survey, so thank you. Then people, this one's always a little harder, I think, for folks, but I wanted to start out also with a slightly nicer survey response. I really want to acknowledge the literally thousands of people that participated in this work for me, many of whom won't ever see it. It was an anonymous survey. Some people did send me contact information, but thank you to them. Another big one, I wanted to acknowledge my committee and some of my other mentors. So committee sitting here, thank you guys all very much for your support over the last few years. I want to also especially comment that David has been putting up with me for over a decade now. So want to explicitly thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. Research assistants also, I've taught probably 400 people or so over the last 4 years, and some of them have actually worked with me a little bit more closely. So Virginia's in the back. And yeah, wanted to thank them. A lot of this work could not have been done without their help and their ideas. Other research collaborators, so a lot of the work that I do is collaborative, and I wanted to acknowledge the people that have helped me and written with me over the last several years and kind of kept this going. Whoops. Peer communities, a lot of lab groups. I think most E-IPER students eventually say something about the fact that they go to like 40,000 different lab groups. Not too different, just 4. But these have been really, really good communities and have been a really great home for actually understanding how interdisciplinary work gets done and how disciplinary work gets done as well. Like I said, I teach a lot. I wanted to acknowledge the people that I've taught with over the last few years, a couple of whom are here. And then E-IPER staff, of course. Thank you to all of you as well. Kind of similarly to what I said to David, Jen's also been dealing with me for about 10 years. When I was an undergrad, I was in bio while Jen was in bio, and she had to tell me that I couldn't have a civil engineer as my advisor if I was going to be a bio major. So interdisciplinary issues have been a thing for a while, but thank you. I made it through. And then kind of the last one, just some of the people that have been like trespassing lightly with me for multiple years. My mom always takes the pictures, so she's not in a whole lot of them, but she took me to a nuclear power plant, which is pretty cool. If you ever have 50 cents and you're in East Germany and want to go into kind of a death trappy steel mill, do that. Thanks to my dad. My sister actually explicitly didn't want to go on a trip with me once because she thought we were going to go to a bunch of hydropower plants and she was not down. And then last of all, just to my husband, Russell, who has come on a lot of these research trips actually, and also looks very nice next to a wind turbine, and allowed me to use his image to send on postcards to 25,000 people. So thank you for that. If people have questions, I'd be really glad to take them. Sammy.
So from like the text mining stuff, like the fiction and nonfiction stuff, you would kind of split it up into emotions, whereas like the archetypes focused on like air quality, safety and stuff. And I was wondering to what extent like you would be able to find mentions of like natural resource degradation or concerns about health in the text.
That's a really good question. So one of the things that I'm working on right now, actually, that is turning out to be hard, but probably will eventually work kind of, is essentially using a bunch of topic modeling techniques where you kind of draw latent associations between words and then using those to populate something that looks a lot like one of these emotional detectors. So if you find a bunch of topics and you see words that are associated with a given type of output, so here's a topic that's all about water, and then kind of feed that into one of the sentiment dictionaries and use it a little bit in a way that it wasn't quite designed for, you can actually start to detect the way that people talk about those resources specifically. So using a topic model to populate a sentiment analyzer is kind of the next frontier there, I think, for me at least. The emotional work, I think, was important just because it did demonstrate that you can get robust-ish data out of this and you can see things that aren't completely weird, which is really, really helpful to know. It's kind of hard to find that stuff sometimes, but yeah, it's next step. So
I actually follow that. I was interested in one aspect of the text analysis, and that is if you found very little joy in both the oil nonfiction and the coal nonfiction. I wonder if that's partly just any economic analysis, which you find low joy, and maybe most of the papers that you write.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. The low joy in the coal, I think, wasn't statistically significant, but it was in the oil, so there's a little bit of a difference there. But yes, nonfiction is very different from fiction. That was one of the reasons we actually wanted to differentiate there. And we did a little bit of other work just looking at all the nonfiction together and all the fiction together, and there's some sort of interesting trends there. But yes, nonfiction is different, tends to have many fewer emotional words, but probably covers a bigger range of things. So the reason that I find it useful is actually just because it is a good place to find sort of, in some cases, dry conversation about more of the topics that I'm interested in. Yeah?
What do you think is the biggest challenges to getting this sort of tool in the hands of decision makers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the plant. I didn't actually plant that. I think the biggest challenge, honestly, is convincing people that using social science is something that is actually using science. In a lot of cases, you hear a lot about policymakers thinking about wanting to make science-based decisions. But a lot of the time when you kind of show up and you're like, wow, there are decades of research behind the fact that I actually can construct an instrument that tells you something important about this, people are a little bit concerned about that sometimes. That's not true in all situations, and I think there are certain situations where people are a lot more receptive to this kind of thing. Honestly, for this particular work, I think the bigger barrier is getting it into LCA first. I think once it's in LCA, that would be a pretty easy leap to getting it into decision processes, but it's got to get into LCA first. Yeah, Christoph.
For me, I love first amazing.
Thank you.
I love it. Can you already see, or do you have an idea where maybe, because of this new insight of values matter, traditional LCAs that we currently take for granted in certain industry might have to be looked at completely with a new lens and might change things?
Yeah, I do actually. I say this to a lot of people. I think LCA is theoretically a great tool, and the way it's implemented is not that great right now. I mean, even independent of the values, I think a lot of the time some of the studies that are being used deeply, especially in a lot of corporate contexts, have some fairly fundamental flaws. So not all of them, but many of them. And I think that while they're useful, and if you have a situation where you really understand that you really only are looking at one aspect of something, maybe that's fine. So I guess the corollary to that being that in a lot of corporate contexts, I think people have a much clearer idea about what the values are in advance, so they kind of just skip that step and say, what we actually care about is greenhouse gases, we're going for it, we're just gonna look at climate this time. And that decision's a little bit more explicit than in some other contexts. So it depends. Some of the stuff that gets published that doesn't think about that explicitly probably needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully. But the ones where people do go in with a mission statement, I think maybe are a little bit less prone to that problem, if that makes sense. Thank you all for coming. Oh yeah, sorry.
How much cost do you think it would add to include the social values compared to like the regular environmental LCA for companies? And how do you justify that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going a little bit like cost-benefit analysis in my head right now because I think if you make a bad decision, the cost is probably worth it up front instead of making that bad decision. And like the gas project we looked at, they sunk millions and millions of dollars into that effort and didn't end up doing anything. So from that perspective, you can usually kind of back justify upfront cost. I do think that it would be a fairly expensive thing to do. LCAs generally are pretty expensive things to do, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why you can't really just show up and say, I'm gonna do a survey every time I wanna do this. So I think I commented at one point, I got a return survey back this morning. I sent that survey out 8 or 9 months ago. Like, these take a really, really long time once you start working, and so that time element is actually also pretty significant, even if you could get the costs down. So yeah, the cost I think is significant. I think it's probably worth it, but it probably would, if you were doing something that's specific to your project, it would probably add several tens of thousands of dollars. If you could get it up to the point where I would really like to see it, which is that you kind of have a set of archetypes that people use in desktop models and just kind of do all the time. It's a little bit more of a one-time shot, but yeah, it remains to be seen. Yeah, a more global product would be pretty difficult. Yeah, and a lot of different languages in that case as well, which something I didn't really talk about, but kind of trying to navigate the Spanish language versus English language elements of this was actually very difficult and very expensive. But yeah, that also would be a difficult thing to do. That's the other reason I still think that if you can get to the point where you're using existing texts and you're using computational tools to get at your archetypes, that's a much better path forward for this. Because in that case, it's basically the same tools, it's just a different vocabulary. But yeah, I think the other really important thing that I should probably have tattooed on my head at this point is this is not intended to be a representative tool. You just want kind of a diversity of perspectives that you can test robustness against. And if you don't need that, cool. But I think at the point where you start using these as deterministic ways of thinking about values in LCA, that's a really bad outcome, actually. So that's my tattoo. It's a little too long for my face, maybe, but start there. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.